Okay, hello everyone. Good morning or good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are very pleased to welcome you to the first of a series of webinars brought to you by IEH Academy, which is the education and training arm of IEH Laboratories and Consulting Group. Today's webinar is entitled Heavy Metals and Contaminants in the Food Industry. Just a few housekeeping notes before we introduce our speakers and get started. This webinar is being recorded and will be available at the IEH Academy website for 2 weeks. Please remember to mute yourself during the webinar. If you have any questions, please write them in the Q&A section and the speakers will address them at the end of the presentation. We will also be sending a follow-up email to attendees with information about how to access the recording, as well as a brief survey, and we would be very pleased to have your feedback on the webinar. Today, we are very fortunate to have 2 industry experts to help us understand and address the rising concern of heavy metals in the food industry. Dr. Don Zink with IEH Laboratories and Consulting Group and Ben Wozniak with Brooks Applied Labs. Dr. Zink has been with the IEH Consulting Group since 2015 when he retired from the FDA. Dr. Zink was with the FDA for 14 years and was involved in the agency's earlier regulatory action involving arsenic in apple juice and in infant rice cereal. Prior to joining the FDA, Dr. Zink worked in the food industry for 19 years in various food safety leadership capacities. Ben Wozniak is in the Technical Services Division of Brooks Applied Labs and has been with the company for over 14 years. Having worked as a laboratory analyst, project manager, and in business development, Ben brings over a decade of experience in analytical methods for metals, as well as elemental speciation to the IEH family of companies. Now I'll turn the platform over to Dr. Zink.
Thank you, Heidi. The purpose of our presentation is to familiarize you with a growing food safety concern, namely that of heavy metals in foods and dietary supplements. While the issue of heavy metals is not new, it's getting a great deal more attention from the public and from regulatory bodies. And we thought this would be a good time to bring everybody's attention to what's been going on recently. We're going to tell you about some of the recent regulatory activities, some of the foods of concern, and about some of the problems associated with testing foods for heavy metals. Can I have the next slide, please? So when we talk about heavy metals, what do we mean? Strictly speaking, heavy metals are higher molecular weight elements with metallic properties. FDA lists metals that are harmful to health, and their list includes elements like arsenic, cadmium, lead, mercury, but also aluminum, antimony, barium, beryllium, silver, strontium, nickel, thallium, uranium, and vanadium. There's also some lower molecular weight elements like copper, tin, and zinc that are metals that can also be toxic in high amounts, but we don't consider these heavy metals. So for the purpose of this presentation, we'll be talking only about lead, cadmium, mercury, and arsenic when we use the phrase heavy metals, although arsenic is technically a metalloid. So generally, whenever you hear anyone talking about heavy metals, it's going to be these 4 heavy metals. Now, unlike more complex chemical compounds, heavy metals are elements that are persistent in the environment, and they don't readily degrade to harmless compounds. Heavy metals often occur naturally and unavoidably in many foods, and they're difficult or in some cases impossible to remove from foods by processing. For most foods, there's no specific regulatory limit for heavy metals. Even small amounts of heavy metals can be harmful, especially when consumed over long periods of time. Some heavy metals are particularly harmful to children, and foods for children should get special consideration. When you think about food safety and heavy metals, you've got to consider both acute and chronic health effects, and often the tolerable limits are driven by those chronic health effects. Now, the science surrounding the toxicity of heavy metals is I would not say it's settled or even fully understood, but we know a lot about the multiple toxic effects of heavy metals, and we're learning more every year, and no one disputes the potential for harm. Children, as I said, are often at greater risk from exposure to these elements. The harmful effects of lead exposure in children is just one well-known example of the potential for harm. Briefly, inorganic arsenic has multiple toxic effects, including carcinogenicity, particularly skin, bladder, and lung cancer, but it also can have cardiac toxicity and do damage to the nervous system, as well as other health effects. Cadmium accumulates in the body throughout life and is primarily toxic to the kidneys, where it can cause irreversible tubular dysfunction. And mercury occurs as inorganic mercury or as organomercury compounds. I'm sure many of you have heard about methyl mercury. Mercury can disrupt cell functions such as DNA and protein synthesis. It can affect kidney function and cause peripheral neuropathy. Lead can also affect multiple organs, but it's best known as a neurodevelopmental toxin that can damage brain development in children and cause severe damage to the brain and kidneys in adults. And lead, of course, clears very slowly from the body and can accumulate over years of exposure. Next slide. Now, there's really a long history of regulatory action over heavy metals in foods. It's, on the one hand, not fair to say this is an emerging issue because a lot has been going on for decades, but it's certainly an issue where there's been recent increases in activity. You can go back to 1991 when the U.S. food industry stopped using lead solder in metal cans. And in 1995, the FDA issued a rule prohibiting the use of lead solder in all food cans. In 1996, FDA banned the use of tin-coated lead foil capsules on wine bottles. It was found that high levels of lead in wine could be attributed to lead residue on the mouth of the bottle when the wine was poured. In 2006, FDA issued guidance limiting the amount of lead in candy likely to be consumed by children. The guidance permits no more than 0.1 part per million lead in this candy. Now, more recently, activism by consumer groups and nonprofit organizations has motivated regulatory action on heavy metals in foods. In 2011, the Dr. Oz TV show fueled concerns of inorganic arsenic in apple juice, and FDA subsequently issued draft guidance on inorganic arsenic in apple juice in 2013. In 2021, Congress introduced the Baby Food Safety Act that would mandate strict limits on heavy metals. We don't anticipate that this act will be passed as written, and FDA seeks to preempt a legislative solution with its closer to zero plan, where the agency will determine appropriate limits for baby foods and possibly other foods for children. And most recently, New York State, their Department of Agriculture and Markets, has proposed some fairly strict limits for heavy metals in spices, although the date at which these might go into effect and the state would begin to take enforcement action on those limits is uncertain. The next slide. In response to this increased attention for heavy metals in foods, we've seen a corresponding increase in requests for heavy metal testing. The graph on the left shows request for testing for lead in foods and dietary supplements, and you can see there's been a big uptick. I think this indicates that quite a few in the industry are paying attention and are reacting to it. You can also see this in Prop 65 60-day notices. Now, a 60-day notice is essentially a letter issued under the authority of Prop 65 advising you that they believe that your food or dietary supplement contains a a prohibitively high amount of lead, and you're given 60 days to respond, either by bringing the lead levels into compliance or by labeling your product with a Prop 65 warning. And you can see again that particularly in 2020 and 2021, those increases. To me, this means that any company that's not currently performing some regular heavy metals testing could be exposing themselves to potential legal risk, while also running the risk of falling behind their competitors who are evaluating ways to do this. And we have seen some indication of companies trying to use lead levels as to competitive advantage. Next slide. So what standards apply to heavy metals in the content of foods? In the US anyway, there are very few specific limits for specific foods. In the US, in lieu of more of these specific limits, there are guidelines that you can use for evaluating heavy metal exposure, and we've summarized those in this table. Most of these are guidelines that are expressed in terms of a tolerable exposure, the micrograms per day or week or month, and are meant to encompass all dietary sources, not just a single food product. You can use these along with serving size and frequency of consumption to determine if your product could have a level of heavy metal in it that would exceed these limits or be of concern. Also, you can look at Prop 65 limits. They're certainly relevant for products sold within California, and these limits tend to be pretty conservative. The FDA has issued an IRL for lead with lower limits applicable for children, and has announced plans to develop similar levels for arsenic, cadmium, and mercury in the future as part of their Closer to Zero action plan. The withdrawn standards from the joint FAO-WHO Expert Committee on Food Additives, just called JECFA, I think reflects our growing knowledge of the impacts of lower level exposure. This is an indication that JECFA is going to reconsider these limits, and I think some of the really conservative limits you see in the Baby Food Safety Act are a reflection of growing concern whether or not we've appropriately established limits. There's additional guidelines in Canada, in the European Union, and China, and other countries, but these are beyond the scope of our presentation today. Given the fact that there's growing evidence of harm from lower level exposures, particularly for arsenic and lead, I think relying on older and less sensitive methods that can only test down to the part per million or hundreds of part per billion levels is really no longer a tenable analytic method. And I think this is particularly true for projects that could have larger serving sizes. Next slide. So how do heavy metals get into food? The main way they get into food is from soil and water. Ben will talk to you later about some other ways that they can get in there. This map you see on the left is the U.S. Geological Survey map for lead in the United States. You could construct similar maps for other countries. This map, you can go on the USGS website, find similar maps for arsenic and cadmium. You shouldn't look at this map and say, oh, well, great. I'll just buy stuff from Florida and I won't have to worry about it. You can get into some very niche areas within the geography of the United States where there are high levels and low levels. I think what you see here is really a reflection of the geology and and the mineral content of soils in the United States. This is not a reflection of what you might find in the water, which could be different. For arsenic, for example, it tends to be present in greater amounts in sedimentary soils as opposed to volcanic soils. If we were looking at a map for arsenic, you would see generally higher levels in the Mississippi River Delta than you would in some area that was primarily like Northern California, that was primarily volcanic soils. Some plants also accumulate heavy metals more than other plants. Rice, for example, accumulates arsenic from soil and water, and the arsenic is deposited in the husk and outer layers of the rice grain. And this tends to be present in other parts of the plant as well, but of course the grain is what we eat. This is why you'll see higher amounts of arsenic in brown rice than you would white rice. Also, the amount of arsenic in rice is affected by how you grow it, whether it's submerged underwater or not, and the particular cultivar of rice can make a difference. Modern food processing equipment is usually not a source of heavy metals in food. Today, virtually all food processing equipment is stainless steel or inert polymers, and it just does not contribute heavy metals to the food. But exposure to brass fixtures or the use of certain filtration aids like the diatomaceous earth product shown in the graph on the right can affect the heavy metal content of food. So you have to be cognizant of this possibility and be certain that you're processing in a way that's not adding heavy metals to the food. Most heavy metals in food, again, are entering the food pre-harvest and not from processing activities. Ben, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you now.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Don. So yeah, as Don was saying, most heavy metals really are introduced into food through pre-processing activities. There are a number of human activities that can contribute to that uptake of heavy metals into food products. Atmospheric deposition, particularly from industrial activities like mining and fossil fuel combustion, and proximity to roads can cause lead contamination, for example. For decades in the United States, tetraethyl lead was used as a gasoline additive, and there is evidence that areas near highways and other heavy trafficked areas can show a legacy of elevated metals concentrations in the soil as a result. Fertilizers can also be a source of heavy metals, and modern agriculture relies heavily on these to maintain crop productivity. Phosphate-based fertilizers in particular are known to potentially be elevated in cadmium, depending on where they are mined or what the source of the phosphorus is. And this has been blamed for elevated cadmium in some crops. There's also a long history of use of organic arsenicals like roxarsone and nitarsone used in poultry and swine production. These arsenicals were added to the feed fed to these animals. The arsenic mostly then passed into the manure, which was often applied to agricultural fields as fertilizer, leading to contamination in certain areas. These drugs were used in the United States, but phased out in the 2010s. But in China, for example, they were more recently banned just in 2019. Likewise, municipal biosolids are sometimes used as fertilizers for agricultural fields, and these can be a source of heavy metals, such that the US EPA actually does regulate the heavy metals content of municipal biosolids used for agriculture. Throughout most of the 20th century as well, arsenical pesticides were widely used in the United States for application to orchards and vegetable crops. Chemicals like lead arsenate, Paris green, calcium arsenate were widely used on fruit and vegetable crops. during World War II and around that era, you could go into your local drugstore and pick up a bag of lead arsenate along with your toothpaste. Then consumers during the World War II era were advised that lead arsenate wasn't harmful to gardens. These products were also applied to other non-consumptive crops like tobacco and cotton as well. On a final note, water can potentially be a source of heavy metals content, depending on the aquifer that, for deep groundwaters that might be used for irrigation purposes. Likewise, if there are any historical uses of leaded pipes or solder, that could be a source of heavy metals during growth. So which ingredients are of greater concern for heavy metals? Some food categories that are known to have potential issues are listed here. For example, rice, like Don mentioned, is known to contain elevated arsenic, depending on various factors, including how it's grown, the cultivar, etc. This has been, consequently, because arsenic is known to be a problem in rice, there have been recent FDA guidance limiting its use in products marketed for children. Apple and grape products can also contain elevated arsenic and lead. Root crops have been shown to be elevated in various heavy metals, depending on the soil in which they're grown. Leafy greens, grains, pulses like legumes and seafood can frequently be a source of elevated cadmium. Cocoa, spices, and mined minerals, again, depending on where they are sourced, can also be significant sources of heavy metals in some cases. Among foods that are generally lower in heavy metals, certain animal proteins, with the exception of any liver or organ meats, can oftentimes be lower, as well as fruiting vegetables like tomatoes. They generally have lower concentrations. This isn't meant to suggest that any of these products can't be part of a healthy diet, but it does mean that sourcing these kinds of ingredients that are lower in heavy metals does require careful planning and a robust sourcing. Taking a look at an example of one food that's received negative press in the last several years, cadmium is known to be concentrated in spinach more so than in other vegetables. And shown here is an example indicating that the concentrations of cadmium in spinach are frequently correlated with the soil cadmium concentrations, and that spinach seems to uptake cadmium more effectively than other crops like romaine lettuce. Most of the spinach grown in the United States is actually grown in the state of California, and roughly 38% of US spinach is estimated to be grown in Monterey County, which is down in this area here. Now, looking at this graph, similar to the one that Don presented earlier of cadmium concentrations in topsoil, we can see that that area in the United States tends to have elevated cadmium relative to many other areas. There is a large data set or publicly available data on the cadmium concentrations of spinach in the United States, both from the nonprofit As You Sow and from the FDA's Total Diet study. Interestingly, when you plot these data points in terms of the amount of cadmium per serving of spinach, you actually see very similar trends, despite the fact that this data was collected over different years, and there's different sizes of these two data sets. Just as some context, 4.1 micrograms per liter is the Prop 65 limit, and so we can see that the vast majority of spinach in the United States, or at least the sources that were tested here, appear to exceed the Prop 65 limit. Similarly, the minimal risk level set by the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry would equate to about 8 micrograms of cadmium per day. So we can see a large portion of cadmium would even exceed that. Now, this doesn't mean that spinach needs to be avoided or that people shouldn't eat it, but it does suggest that long-term consumption of spinach could pose risks over time. And in acknowledgement of this, spinach growers and groups like the California Leafy Greens Research Board have been studying ways to minimize the uptake of cadmium into spinach. Looking at another example, as Don was mentioning earlier, baby food manufacturers have been under increasing scrutiny to reduce the heavy metals content of their products, in part due to the higher sensitivity of children to heavy metals uptake. Some recent examples of this activity include the U.S. House of Representatives report, the proposed Baby Food Safety Act, the FDA's Closer to Zero Action Plan, and most recently, just earlier this month, there was a settlement between the California Attorney General and a major infant formula manufacturer to limit the amount of lead in their formula to no more than 5 to 7 ppb. This is also then increasing pressure on growers and ingredient suppliers to reduce the heavy metals burden of their products, as many food manufacturers are currently evaluating their supply chains and considering reformulating their products to minimize the amount of heavy metals in them. One category of produce that's been targeted for this is root vegetables. Just as an example shown here, this includes publicly available data and data that we've also seen in our lab. And what we see is that a vast majority of root vegetables can indeed contain lead less than 5 ppb, which would put them in compliance with the limits proposed in the Baby Food Safety Act. However, there is a large percentage that also exceeds the 5 ppb of lead, including a fairly substantial portion that might even contain over 50 ppb of lead. I want to point out that this data isn't necessarily meant to be random or representative of all products for sale in the US market, just what is publicly available and or that we've seen here at our laboratory, Brooks Applied. Just for some further context, a typical serving size of baby food for like a pureed vegetable might be around 4 ounces. For a 4-ounce serving of a product, it would exceed the Prop 65 limit for lead if it contained over 5 ppb. So again, the vast majority of root vegetables might exceed that. Likewise, if it contained greater than 30 ppb, that would currently exceed the FDA's interim reference level for children. This data really isn't meant to demonize any particular industry, but really just to suggest that crops from certain areas or fields may need to be avoided for products that are targeted towards sensitive populations like children. It also means that routine testing of these crops and the agricultural soils in which they're grown can aid in ensuring that a finished product will consistently test low in heavy metals. There are some advanced analytical techniques that can be used for studying how heavy metals get into foods and how they could potentially be minimized. A really brief example shown here is Brooks Applied Labs has tools for investigating the spatial distribution of heavy metals in agricultural products. This here is a thin section of a root vegetable with the skin on the right side, and on the far left, the core of the root. Using an advanced technique known as laser ablation, inductively coupled plasma, triple quadrupole mass spectrometry, we can observe that for this particular sample, there actually appears to be an elevated concentration of arsenic around the skin, around the exterior, but also that there might be hot spots near the interior of the root itself. So as mentioned earlier, spices can also contain elevated levels of heavy metals. There are no specific federal limits for heavy metals and spices at this time, although products sold in California are subject to limits under Prop 65. And each month there are 60-day notices filed under Prop 65 that reference elevated levels of metals in spices, particularly for lead. Recently, the New York State of Agriculture and Markets has proposed new action levels for heavy metals and spices. They currently have a 1 ppm class 2 action level limit for inorganic arsenic, cadmium, and lead, but they've proposed the lower limits shown in this table. It is our understanding that these are not being enforced at this time, and that the American Spice Trade Association is in discussion with New York State regarding these standards and what implementation date might apply. Although even though these aren't being enforced currently, we have seen a number of companies be concerned that they could at one point be enforceable. Looking more closely at some specific spices, we can see that among tested samples here, there are certain spices that appear to be generally compliant with these proposed limits, chili powder being one example, where most of the samples tested below, whereas other products, specifically herbs like basil, oregano, and thyme, do appear generally to have elevated lead that might make sourcing these spices that are compliant with those proposed limits difficult. Looking a little bit more closely at the lead distribution of one of the rhizomes here, turmeric, we see that, again, a large percentage of the turmeric is in compliance with the limit, but there is a wide distribution of concentrations, including those in excess of 100 parts per billion of lead. This is particularly concerning because some spices are not just used in food products, but there is a growing interest in using spices like cinnamon and turmeric in particular for dietary supplements. When the consumption rates for dietary supplements are generally much higher than what is used in food, this could mean that these supplements could be significant sources of heavy metals exposure for certain populations that consume dietary supplements on a more frequent basis. So this issue doesn't just affect food manufacturers, but also supplement manufacturers as well. Looking a little bit more closely at heavy metal sampling, given that we know that there are these issues with heavy metals, companies which haven't been regularly testing their ingredients and finished products really should begin doing so. But properly evaluating the risk that a product might propose does require careful planning. You can't simply collect a small amount of a sample and submit it to a lab for testing, as that may not produce representative results. We've seen a few examples of this that clients have had to deal with. For example, if you test a small portion of a finished ingredient, it might indicate that it's compliant with some standard that you're trying to achieve. But later on, if a state or federal agency collects larger sampling, more samples per lot, that could reveal that there are exceedances of that lot. Another example we've seen is that many manufacturers do test their raw ingredients for heavy metals. And based on the proportions of those ingredients in the finished product, they may calculate that the finished product should be compliant with whatever limit they're trying to achieve. But then later on, when they actually test the finished product, they can find exceedances of that limit. And both of these can be signs of heterogeneity and improper sampling design. While the FDA doesn't have, to our knowledge, any specific guidance with regards to heavy metal sampling in food products, there is useful guidance found in the FDA's Bacteriological Analytical Manual. Specifically, sampling for contaminants like heavy metals should be statistically significant, and it should be performed in conformance with a documented plan. As part of that plan, you want to consider factors like the magnitude of heavy metals concentrations in a product, as well as how variable they may be, with greater sampling frequencies being applied to ingredients that are either higher in heavy metals or that show larger heterogeneity. Two different types of sampling can be employed. Composite sampling, wherein you take multiple subsamples that are combined into a single analytical sample that is sent to a lab for testing. This is particularly useful for identifying if a finished lot is indeed compliant with whatever limit you're trying to achieve. But also testing multiple discrete samples individually can be useful, as it can reveal variability in a product. This generally, though, is more expensive. So usually discrete sampling, collecting multiple individual samples, is done particularly when you want to evaluate a new ingredient source or, say, a new product line. And IEH consultants can work with clients to help design robust sampling plans to account for these factors. So once a sample has been collected, they need to be sent to a lab for testing. But testing low levels of heavy metals is not trivial. For one example, back in 2011, the Dr. Oz Show aired a story suggesting that a major brand of apple juice contained 36 ppb of arsenic. Subsequent testing by the FDA and by Brooks Applied Labs of the same lot indicated that no more than 6 ppb of arsenic was indeed present in that apple juice. Additional investigations suggested that the laboratory that the Dr. Oz Show used was using a method of analysis that was designed for water samples, and that it did not properly account for the higher sugar content that is present in juice. More recently, in 2020, the Baby Food Council commissioned a proficiency test to evaluate the accuracy of labs performing heavy metals testing in foods. Of the labs that initially participated, over roughly 40% failed to consistently produce reliable results. And as shown in this graph here, a number of labs reported results that were erroneously high, and there was a lab that reported results that were erroneously low. Even among the labs that did produce acceptable results, only 25% of labs were deemed highly proficient for being able to measure the background of metals that are natively present in vegetable purees. I must note that Brooks Applied Labs was the first independent commercial lab in the United States to be deemed highly proficient as part of this proficiency study. So what should you look for when you're trying to identify a lab to perform heavy metals testing for your food products? Well, first and foremost, any modern lab doing heavy metals testing in food should be using a strong acid microwave digestion, followed by an ICP-MS analysis, employing an effective interference removal technique. Now, we recognize that a lot of clients may not be chemists like us. So things that you should look out for are references to the FDA Elemental Analysis Manual, Method 4.7, or the AOAC Method 2015-01. Both of these are robust, well-tested methods that use these techniques and have been demonstrated to produce accurate results. You also want to make sure that when you talk to your lab, that they're offering a quantitation limit that is suitably low. Sometimes labs will provide you with their detection limit, but you should always inquire further about what their quantitation limit is. And that's really because of uncertainty. This graph here shows the relative uncertainty or the variability in a result with relation to how close it is to the quantitation limit. And we see on the far right, when the results are much above the quantitation limit, the range of values, the precision is high, or the spread of values that you get is low. But that as you start to get near the detection limit, which is on the far left, you'll see that the spread of values is very high, or the precision is very poor. So you ideally want to make sure that you have a quantitation limit that is roughly 1/3 to 1/10 whatever regulatory or action limit you're trying to achieve. There's also precedence for this. In the recent settlement with the California Attorney General that dictated a enforceable limit of 5 to 7 ppb of lead in a particular manufacturer's infant formula, it actually requires a quantitation limit of 1 ppb to be able to demonstrate compliance with a 5 to 7 ppb regulatory limit. There's other useful guidelines found in the Baby Food Council recommendations. You can look those up, but particularly you want to make sure you're using a lab that is indeed accredited and that has been demonstrated to be able to measure heavy metals in foods, ideally as determined via a proficiency test. You specifically want to avoid labs too that are reporting results as 0 or less than a high quantitation limit. Several companies have had to deal with negative press when they are using labs with high quantitation limits, and then later on it's discovered that their products do indeed contain heavy metals at a detectable concentration when a more modern, robust method is used. Final slide here. You may have noticed, if you're paying close attention, that many of the regulatory standards for arsenic are based on inorganic arsenic, not total arsenic. And that's because there are numerous other forms of arsenic present in food products, many of which are of lower toxicity or may even be non-toxic. Some classical examples include shellfish, fish, and seaweeds. They frequently contain high arsenic concentrations, but only a small proportion of that is the most toxic in regulated forms, inorganic arsenic. Likewise, rice frequently contains a large portion of less toxic forms of arsenic, and vegetables and fruit also contain some of these forms of arsenic that are of lesser toxicity. Now, inorganic arsenic testing is more difficult. It requires a more advanced analysis involving liquid chromatography coupled to ICP-MS. Even fewer labs have demonstrated proficiency for that. Therefore, you want to generally first test for total arsenic. And then if the results are above your action or regulatory level, you want to consider speciation. This is also useful because speciation is generally a more expensive test than just a simple total arsenic test. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that Brix Applied Labs has over a decade and a half of experience performing inorganic arsenic testing. And indeed, my colleague, our technical director, Hakan Gerliak, and myself were part of an international collaboration along with scientists from the FDA and the National Research Council of Canada, which certified the inorganic arsenic content of the Bari 1 infant rice cereal reference material. And with that, I'll turn it over to Don for some closing thoughts.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. So I think what we've tried to do here is make a case that if you're going to get on top of possible heavy metal risks with your food products, now's the time. I think that there's still time to see where you might be and start looking at your supply chain and see what you might need to do in the way of putting together a continuous improvement program. Heavy metal scientists like to say there is no safe level of heavy metals in foods, but the way to go is to drive it down to the lowest possible amount of heavy metal content you can have. And this is a time when regulators are re-examining their standards, and it's very important for you to be able to respond to any proposed regulatory limits as to how practical or achievable they might be. There's a lot more research needed as well on baseline amounts and where to source foods that are lower in heavy metals. And I don't think you can get there without beginning to test for this. Fortunately, the testing is not terribly expensive or time consuming, and the nation has got pretty good capacity to do these kinds of testing. So with that, I'd like to wrap up our presentation, and we'll try to respond to questions. See.
Okay, it looks like there's a number of questions. We can try to take some of them. Let's see here. In the question and answer section, Rob Thomas asks if we've done any work characterizing heavy metals in cannabis-infused food products. Brix Applied Laboratories has not specifically done that, but I know one of our sister laboratories has. I don't have that data available in front of me at this time, though. Let's see here. Lily asks, should organic arsenic be of concern? That's a good question. That's really the state of the science is advancing on that. Organic arsenic really encompasses dozens of different forms of arsenic, some of which are definitely demonstrated to be non-toxic, like the arsenopatane, which is the main form found in fish. But there are other forms of organic arsenic that are believed to be have some toxicity concerns. It's just regulatory agencies have not to date really been focusing on that. Inorganic arsenic is more highly toxic, so that's been the focus to our knowledge.
I think the toxicity of DNA may be under reconsideration. This is dimethyl arsenate. And there's some indications that it might be a bit more toxic than we thought in previous years, but that's still emerging science.
Let's see. Felipe Costa says they would like our opinion on the different guidelines within different species, predatory versus non-predatory fish, and the limit of mercury allowed to be consumed. Do you have any comments on that one, Don?
Well, I'll simply say that you do see increased amounts of mercury the larger the fish. If you're wanting to source salmon that has lower amounts of mercury, certainly sourcing smaller fish is going to be helpful in that regard. You know, as a fisherman, I like to catch them as big as I can. But if you're talking salmon and tuna and methyl mercury, smaller is better than larger.
So Letitia Reyes asked, what is the allowable limit of cadmium in soils? That, particularly for spinach production, that's a challenging answer. To the best of my knowledge, there are no, these regulations and guidelines can vary from state to state. I'm not aware that there is a federal limit on soils. Don, do you have any comments on that?
No, I'm not aware of any limit either.
And then someone's asking a Prop 65 limit for heavy metals and peanuts. What we can say there is Prop 65 limits, they generally are not specific to a particular product. It depends on the serving size and then the concentration of the heavy metals in the product. You can use that to calculate the potential exposure and then compare that to the Prop 65 guidelines. There are some cases, I will say, that there have been some litigation where I think for certain categories of products, there may be exceptions to that. I'm not familiar with one specific to peanuts, though. Let's see here. Matthew asks, what do you see as the responsibilities of the material suppliers versus manufacturers? That's a good question. Do you want to take that one, Don?
Yeah, in the United States, of course, we have strict liability laws. So if someone was going to go after the manufacturer of a food product for having excessive heavy metals in it, in theory, they could go after the whole supply chain as sharing in that liability. So, you know, it really can be a sticky thing to get into once you become the target of litigation for this. And we would certainly rather see companies get out in front of this before they're targeted by someone, particularly under Prop 65.
There are a lot of questions here, so I apologize if we do not get to all of them. I want to, before we answer a few more here, I want to let you know that you can fill out a post-webinar survey. You'll be getting an email about that, but you can also reach out to Don and myself. Here are our email addresses again if we are not able to get to your question on this call. Sarah asks, is there a lab database for proficient heavy metals testing? There is one example of such a database, and that is on the Baby Food Council's website. The labs that have been determined to be proficient according to their standards are listed there. You can search that. You can, if you can't find it, you can always reach out to me and I can provide you that link as well. Let's see here.
Then there's a question here. When Sarah Oxendale asked, when occurring as part of the agricultural process and no limits by FDA, how do we begin testing? Should we work with individual ingredient industries? You know, I think the best practice is to first reach out to your suppliers and say, what do you know about the heavy metal content of what you're supplying to us? Do you have specifications? Do you have any test data? And if you do think it advisable for you to begin doing some testing yourself, I would talk to the supplier about that. Suppliers just hate it when somebody blindsides them with some data. For example, if you did some testing and found amounts of heavy metals in there, or a heavy metal that was so high that it might create a product safety concern, well, your supplier would be, you know, pretty unhappy to hear about the initiative at that point. So I think it is a really good idea to work with your suppliers as much as you can. Ultimately, you're going to need that supplier in helping you source ingredients with lower amounts of heavy metals.
So an anonymous attendee asked if they had to test wheat flour for chromium. It's a good question. Chromium is on the list of potential heavy metals, like Don mentioned very early in the talk. It wasn't the focus of this, most of the results that we were going over here. But potentially, like Don mentioned, it is good to at least start monitoring for these things. And if you see elevated levels, then trying to identify if there is some kind of standard that you might need to comply with. I don't know if you have any other comments on that, Don, about wheat flour and chromium.
No, I don't. I'm not, I don't personally have any knowledge of chromium issues in wheat flour, but you know, always be interesting to take a look. There was another question down here, Ben, about lead levels in prunes. I think they might be referring to the recent recall of dried prunes for lead. You can perhaps elaborate on that.
Yeah, there have been particularly some Prop 65 notices and recalls recently on elevated levels of lead in prunes. To my knowledge, these are specific types of prune products. I believe they are salted and in some case spiced prunes. The little bit of information we've seen suggests that this could be coming from, the lead may be coming from, again, the salt or the spices, but I don't know that that's been completely settled. And then they're asking a comment on sources of food coming from Asia where heavy metal pollution may be a concern or a major concern. Yeah, I mean, definitely there are all areas throughout the world where there are elevated levels of heavy metals. And I think, you know, the FDA does have import alerts and does screen certain products that are known to potentially be more likely to have exceedances. But the problem with a lot of heavy metals is like we tried to show with even like the elemental distribution of heavy metals in some soils, it can vary so widely. So I don't think there's necessarily just one country that's to blame for this. All countries have these problems. Someone was asking you, Don, if you could comment why we're obsessed with ppb levels in foods when what is important is micrograms per serving. Toddler snacks are 7 grams versus 4 ounces for pouched products. A 5 or 10 ppb limit for 2 liters of drinking water is far beyond worrying about 5 ppb in a food product.
Well, that's right. The what counts is of course 2 things: how much is in the food and how much of that food is consumed. And of course, the population is important too, children versus adults. So what we need to know in order to set good limits for food is first of all, we need a dose response curve for the health effects we're concerned about. And then we need to really understand how much food is being consumed and whether that food is typically consumed by vulnerable populations. You might take, for example, the 90th percentile amount of consumers. And then from that, the dose response curve and the amount consumed, you need to determine what would be an amount that would have a negligible health risk, chronic health risk. And it could differ for which endpoint you're talking about, whether you're talking about a carcinogenicity endpoint for arsenic, or whether you're talking about a cardiotoxicity endpoint. It's not a simple matter to set a limit for food. Ultimately, you will wind up with some science-based amount that can be present in a food that would have an insignificant lifetime risk of harm. Absent that, absent that kind of limit provided to you, you have to consult sources like ASTDR and Prop 65, maybe European Union standards, and obtain food consumption data from a database like NHANES and do your own estimate of what daily exposure or weekly exposure might be for a particular food product. It's not real simple, and it would certainly be a simpler world if we just had a big long list of tolerable limits for all kinds of different foods, but we will not soon have that. Let's see, here's another question here. How much heavy metals are transferred to food by plants using garden hoses and sprayers as part of the process, adding water, and the use of garden hoses and sprayers to clean and sanitize food contact surfaces? Well, nowadays, nearly all of these things are inert plastics and stainless steel. It's never a good idea to go to your local hardware store and buy equipment for your food plant. We would prefer that equipment used in food plants be specifically manufactured for that. But having recently been in the garden hose market, I noticed that garden hoses now seem to have mostly aluminum fitments on them instead of the old brass fitments. Certainly brass can be a contributor of heavy metals in water, particularly if that water sits in, for example, a brass valve for a period of time. But I expect that for most of the time in food plants that are using just a consumer market hose to spray down equipment or to add water to food, that the hose itself and the sprayers themselves are negligible or not even a measurable source of heavy metals for that food. You do have to think about water. Water in some parts of the country, particularly if it's well water, can have significant amount of heavy metal in it. For example, arsenic in some parts of the country, you can have hundreds of parts per billion arsenic in well water. So it's important to know what your inputs are in your food process. I think with that, we've reached our time limit here, and we're going to wrap up the presentation. Again, anyone can reach out to us with specific questions or anything we didn't answer here, and we'll try to get back to you, even if we need to research it a bit. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, for attending.